This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Thank you very much for those papers. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. We'll take a round of 3 questions.
Three great papers for now. I can only ask the one. So this is for Robert. The description you had of the CIA director, sorry, I've forgotten his name, memo about the Venezuelan British-Guinea border dispute. How clear is it that actually becomes State Department's policy? Because in the US, you kind of touch business, and some of your talk yourself. You sometimes the State Department has one view, the CIA has another. How do we know that the State Department is just saying to the CIA, well, it's all very nice, but we know what we're doing, sort of, or other elements? So how clear is it that actually set up a policy as opposed to being the view of a very senior official? Secondly, given what you said fitted quite well with what I've read before, given he had Stalinist tendency, why did he choose Kadoorie? Now, as his economist, do you have any theory that now Kadoorie is very, very socialistic, but he's definitely not Stalinist at all, and his model of how the economy should be run in some ways is importantly different. So it's a weird choice.
A number of the papers already today, and 2 here, the one about British Guyana and about Canada, also had some. Excuse me?
Are you German?
Yes. I'm not. I'm dealt with, or a question came up that's also a question about Cold War diplomacy. It's how important are personalities, how important are issues, differences, and so on. And we earlier discussed Kennedy's sort of pragmatism as a certain approach. Is there anything you can, from your research or more general, can say about, is personality and getting along with someone more important during the Kennedy presidency or for Kennedy than maybe for other presidents? There's difference all the time, of course, with different governments, but obviously even Baker and him had a lot of trouble getting along, and the same was true with Guyana. We had other cases today, maybe we can assist.
I think it wasn't just CIA policy because he was reflecting the meeting from the special group, which was the entire covert operation. So I think that's why, because the Alexis Johnson, the number 2 at the State Department, was part of that committee. So,
right, and it doesn't say the State Department disagreed or something. It's a sort of consensus, everyone's agreed. So unless they're very bureaucratically incompetent.
And the Kennedy administration was, but nonetheless, I think on this they were pretty good. And then why Nicholas Caldor? Because again, Jagan is trying to kind of stay on the good side of the West until independence. Once he's got independence, call Charles Bettelheim back, maybe. But at this point, he's trying to stay on the straight and narrow.
So Kador's as left wing as you can get without picking someone who's obviously pro-Soviet.
Correct. And a bad choice is when Caldor helped Kwame Nkrumah, it led to riots in Ghana, and I think there were also riots in Ceylon as well from his assistance. So, wouldn't have been my pick. And personality, Kennedy, I think personality played a pretty big role with him. Eisenhower just drove him crazy. In Guinea, I don't want to steal the thunder from one of the next groups, but in Guinea, he got along. He met twice with Sékou Touré. Got along very well with him, even though the guy was a monster. And didn't get along so well with Nkrumah, and probably CIA was probably working against Nkrumah as a result. He tried a lot of personal diplomacy with the Africans. There's a new book by Phil Muhlenbeck about his relations with the Africans. And, you know, just as Chetty Dragon thought he could win over Kennedy with his personality, Kennedy won over much of Africa with his. So I think that he knew his charm and used it.
I think in the Canadian case, personality is obviously extremely important. There's this issue in 1962 where Diefenbaker tries to blackmail Kennedy with this document, and Kennedy blows up and says, "I never want to see him again." But essentially turns over the sort of high-level policy making to Dean Rusk and says, "Dean, you have to take over the Canada file now because I know I hate Diefenbaker and I'll do the wrong thing." So he knew personality in this case was very important, and Dean Rusk takes over, so Canada pulls in. But I think personality is very important in politics itself, in international politics, especially. And George Ball, in one of his books, he's got this wonderful passage talking about how, as a man who crafted foreign policy, sort of a professional diplomat, how he hated summits because you get these clashing personalities and everything that go wrong. And he's sort of thinking about home and Elton J in 1964 about argue about buses, the Leyland bus scandal. It's a disaster. It's a complete disaster. As you get these conflicting personalities, especially this time, you get De Gaulle and Kennedy, all these kind of great egotistical kind of people meeting in a room, and obviously Cuba's kind of things happen, the wrong things get said. So personal agency is very important. So Donald Watt did about 40 years ago, he was in this sort of 7 book on personalities.
I don't think I say anything personality in politics when it comes to Castro. I think there were probably legal prime minister, but Castro should probably be on the list of the personality that Kennedy couldn't stand. But
now, I might be reaching here, but my question is, and if you could address it, I guess, but Luca maybe more so. And it's also, it stems from something that Sir Lawrence said earlier. And it's, I hope I phrase this correctly. You know, Kennedy's sort of love, it used to have a love of the intrigue, the spies, the undercover, the kind of almost Machiavelli plotting stuff going on. And I just wondered, what does that tell you about his attitude to the military establishment? Does what you've seen so far make you think that he had equal kind of respect for them, or was he easily just tempted into feeling strong about his commander-in-chief role, and the military will do what I say when I tell them to do it? Or was there a bit more to it? Do you see what I mean? It's sort of
to be honest, the two types of people that Kennedy started to despise most after the Bay of Pigs are the military and the CIA. So they initially thought to put Robert Kennedy as the head of this new operation before it was called Mongoose. But then they put Lansdale precisely to call in an outsider, pretty much like General Maxwell Taylor that took a big role in counseling the White House and so on, to take responsibilities away from the military, because Kennedy didn't trust the military that much. And it's also clear during the missile crisis when the whole idea that the military suggested that if we bombed the Soviet would do nothing. Kennedy didn't trust the military in a sense. And he was extremely fascinated with, I think, if we go back to the previous question on personality, we not only have to look at personality in terms of like hating someone, but also in terms of fascination, because Kennedy had a massive fascination with Richard Bisson, the guy who sold him pretty much the Bay of Pigs. And he had pretty much the same type of fascination with Edward Lansdale, precisely for this reason of being heroes of the covert action, heroes of disguise, and so on. And he was massively disappointed when the man selected by the CIA to cooperate with Mongoose was like a pear-shaped, drunk man, pretty fat, and Harvey. And when he met Harvey, he said, "So you must be our James Bond," with a sense of probably discomfort because it didn't look like Daniel Craig or Sean Connery. But he had a fascination for the old intelligence, undercover. And Robert Kennedy was the same. I mean, in his notes, it doesn't refer to General Lansley. Lansley refers to the ugly American, for the famous book, The Ugly American. So there was certainly a role of fascination, and in a sense, also distrust of the military, but I would say especially after the Bay of Pigs and the fact that the military pretty much washed this event of the Bay of Pigs plan.
Can I throw something in?
Okay.
I interviewed Kennedy's #2 at Intelligence and Research. His name is Hughes, and he said, "You'd be amazed that Kennedy's turned to covert operations whenever there was a problem in the Third World." And I asked him, "Well, can you name them?" And he said, "No, I can't." But I think it was in part because of his distrust for the Army, and also his fear of things getting out of hand, of miscalculation. You use the hidden hand, then as long as it's not a massive invasion, then you're good.
Also, I mean, he's a young man, he reads a lot, and it's the zeitgeist of the time. I think you get James Bond novels, you get Graham Greene writing, sort of scandalous things. You get Man from U.N.C.L.E., you get these kinds of things he tapped into to make the museum in person.
It's just interesting for someone who might, for a less, let's say, sake of argument, for a less stable president, all of that sort of intrigue and sort of acute paranoia, aka Richard Nixon. So it's kind of interesting. The paranoia element wasn't really in there, so maybe that helped.
Yes, that's just a quick point. He also kind of feared that the military might push his end in crisis, or that might actually damage him. There is the famous movie 7 Days in May. Kennedy was actually behind the, in a sense, promotion of the movie, in which the military kind of takes over the White House. So it's Kennedy feared the military.
Yeah. This is for Luca. 2 questions on the Mongoose part. The list of interesting and fascinating names for different plots was long and very interesting. So, first question, does this sort of fascination that you just discussed, does that also explain why that was sort of possible to even get on the drawing board, #1, and #2? What was the connection actually between all of this, which was obviously sort of on an operational level under Lansdale, and then the sort of more political group, the special group, and the special group augmented, what they were called, under sort of mainly the guidance of either Robert Kennedy, McGeorge Bundy, or I think Maxwell Taylor ended up chairing it. What was sort of the connection, and how much were they actually sort of knowledgeable about these weird plots?
Well, in terms of knowledge, when it comes to this plot, I'm not talking about the assassinations one that is always a shadowy area. In terms of this plot, they were perfectly knowledgeable and about these operations, this stuff. And in the first stages of Mongoose, we can say that Lansdale pretty much has a free hand. If you look at the document, they write out this eternal series of tasks, and everything is in the smallest detail, everything is covered, but is completely detached from reality. He has a whole series of hundreds and hundreds of steps that will take him from starting the operation to overthrowing Castro and having this marvelous parade in Havana or touchdown play or something. And at the start, in the phase, Mongoose pretty much never goes behind phase 1.5, although it was divided in 6 phases. The first one starts and is pretty much on the intelligence collection and so on. But they make so many stupid mistakes in phase 1 that everybody is skeptical if we should move to phase 2 or not. So they have a debate, and there are 2 positions. One by John McCone saying, can we stop this please, because it's pretty much counterproductive. Can we go on a more traditional intelligence collection activity and so on? And other people actually, including Robert Kennedy, calling for much more, calling for boom and bang and so sabotage. But is a funny read, to be honest, because some of the plots are out of this world, and then they fail to pull off even the most uncomplicated issues, such as, I don't know, transporting a bomb in some place, they get stopped and so on, which are pretty much the same problem that I encountered in the Bay of Pigs, like the coral reef. The Cuban exiles have told the CIA, look, these are some coral reefs, we cannot go with the boats there. And the CIA said, no, don't worry, it's just the shade of the clouds. And then it was the coral reef. I mean, they had control, they knew the stuff, and at first they were, in a sense, I think, it goes back to the problem of fascination. They tended to believe Lansdale's reputation was so big for what he had done in Southeast Asia. Not much, to be honest, but they tended to believe him. They tended to, okay, if he has this plan, we go ahead and so on. But we never moved beyond phase 1. But in terms of knowledge, they knew the operations, they knew what type of activity was going around, and either also like more moderate people in a sense, like Dean Rusk, when it comes to discussing actually some real stuff, say military invasion or so on, say, no, I think military invasion is too far. Let's go as far as we can with these fancy plans and see what happens.
This is for Asa. What would you, I suppose it's sort of to what degree, like my observation of sort of Canadian foreign policy towards the US in like the last 60 years has been this rhetorical difference combined with never actually being difficult in practice. So the classic case of this, to use a very recent example, is the Iraq War, where you got lots of strong opposition and complete and utter cooperation in actually doing it, right down to secret internment camps, and handing people over and so forth. Stuff that's borderline illegal. To what degree is Diefenbach the reason for this kind of behaviour? What happens with Diefenbacher that he gets into lots of trouble, both for when he takes anti-Americanism beyond that he sort of restrains anti-Americanism afterwards. And secondly, who's actually making policy? Because you seem to suggest Kennedy and Rusk, but I mean Canada isn't that important from the US perspective. Like it's not the Soviet Union. Presumably, to a large degree, this policy has been made by someone more junior, even before you get that special assistance.
Essentially, it's Kennedy for the first year on sort of big things like Laos, nuclear weapons, Cuba, and the alliance programs. They're really pushing Canada. After that, it's George Bull and the US. So that's sort of. But I mean, he has this big thing of sort of winning Canada over. Because it's his first foreign trip, he goes there, there's 100,000 people on the street cheering for him. I think that kind of helps all these people like him. Not that he's a vain person. In terms of Canadian foreign policy, there's obviously a rhetoric of sort of distancing itself from Canada, from the United States that goes on in Canada. Sometimes it does go the other way. So there's a Canadian foreign minister, or Canadian prime minister in 1965, makes a speech at Temple University where he says to please Mr. Johnson don't do Operation Rolling Thunder essentially, and he does this on American soil, which is a very big faux pas, and Johnson calls him down to the Texas White House, lifts him up by his lapels and says, you pissed on my rug, Mr. Prime Minister, and then harangues him in the garden for an hour and a half. Gives him the real treatment. So when Canada does overstep, obviously because it's viewed as the nice, friendly people from the north who don't raise their voices. When Canada does overstep, there's obviously a sort of an overreaction that does happen. And this issue of the press release in 1963, I mean, this is Diefenbaker essentially every 3 months he says, yes, in 3 months' time, I'll sign this nuclear agreement with you, and it goes on for about 5 years, 4 years. So this statement comes the same week as Charles de Gaulle denounces this Anglo-Saxon alliance of the nuclear weapons. So it's terrible timing on Diefenbaker's part to lie basically about these agreements in the House of Commons. And the Americans finally call his bluff when they've had enough. So the Canadians do try to be quiet, but also in actual policy, but have a rhetorical kind of difference. So we didn't join the Iraq War, but we cooperated in some ways. So we do those kinds of things. We didn't join the Viet Nam War, but we spied before you get to the Americans, and we dropped it down to the International Control Commission, and things like that.
So in both cases,
We play both sides of the coin.
very negative rhetoric.
Yeah.
Combined with incredibly close cooperation, which is, I think, is rare you get such an extreme happen. I mean, this is sort of, this chiefly for Luca, but I think the rest of the panel could probably come on if they want. To what degree does it matter that Kennedy's so inexperienced? Like, as all the things you're talking about in particular, is less true there. It just strikes me the fact that he's basically never been in charge of anything seems very important, both in terms of working how organisations work. But secondly, the fact he's been so unimportant politically. He's not Eisenhower, he's not even someone like Johnson or Nixon, who's used to CIA said X, oh, actually this has turned out to be complete rubbish. So to what degree do you think these kind of mistakes he's making are just because, and it certainly seems to me to fit with this idea of secret services as this magic box that can solve all your problems for you. What degree do you think, because basically he's spent, his political experience consists of 14 years of talking a lot, running for election, and not actually having any effect on anything really?
To be honest, I think in these terms, the Bay of Pigs certainly represent a turning point. After the Bay of Pigs, it famously become much more skeptical of CIA advice, of military advice, and so on. And in a sense, in my paper, which is not here, but will be there sometime, there is a kind of a gap between the complete failure of the Bay of Pigs, say, end of April 61, for about 6 months, in which it seems that Kennedy is finally coming to realize that you have to think a lot on Cuba, that you have to listen to various opinions and so on. There are NSC meetings, there is McNamara is more involved with the Pentagon and so on. And they seem to evaluate options. And so in a sense it's quite surprising that then they dismiss all the work that they've done and go back to something not that different from being fascinated with a far-fetched plan. For example, in mid-1961, they dismissed what has been called the Cuban Peace Offensive. And it might be argued that it was dismissed chiefly for domestic political reasons, because after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, if you were seen establishing a modus vivendi in Che Guevara's terms with Cuba, it would not have played very well politically and so on. But I think inexperience plays a part only to a certain extent. I think it's more a problem of fascination, but also there is in a sense, I think, a realization that solving completely the problem of Cuba is going to be either extremely risky or pretty much impossible. Because you realize that invading Cuba might create extreme problems, either not in Cuba, in other areas. I don't think the problem is being bogged down in Cuba. I don't think that's the main concern, although if you listen to Fidel Castro, they would have had the United States fighting for 50 years or so. But the problem is the uncertainty about the possible Soviet reaction. What are the Soviets going to do? Where are they going to react? How are they taking it? And then I think the inexperience plays out a bit again in the Vienna summit. And again, the Vienna summit is another sort of learning moment for Kennedy, because he goes in as, I can't remember which one of the presenters said, winning over with a personality. It had always been suggesting that if only he could meet Khrushchev directly, he could win him over, they could discuss the things more clearly without bureaucrats in the middle and so on. But it doesn't really play out as well. So I think there are some moments in which inexperience plays a role, but there are some other issues like fascination and the willingness to try to do something, but the realization of massive risk if you do it all.
Okay, just a question?
Sorry, I missed part of your Berwick, actually, Diefenbecker thing. Sounds just crazy to me. But how much do you think that that whole series of events, I know it was quite some time back, but how much do you think that that set the long-term trend for the US-Canadian relationship when it came to commenting or making any kind of stand on US activities around the world, on the military or intervention, things like that? Did it actually set a long-term trend, or did it just last a set period of time? And is there a point where you can say, well, actually, it's a lot more of an equal relationship now? Or
in terms of commenting on US foreign, Canadians have always, and this sort of goes back, Canadians have always taken a rhetorical stance. Many prime ministers take a rhetorical stance against the United States, usually, but always cooperated quietly. And I think the rhetorical stance against the United States is to placate a very an anti-American sentiment in Canada. It's always existed since 1867 or 1789 when the Whigs split north. To placate a small but loud anti-American group that can be very politically troublesome. But there's always been quiet cooperation because we're very close allies of the United States. We're deeply integrated economically. So all the things, I mean, Baker at one point, he's lecturing about you shouldn't do these things with Cuba. We're going to trade with Cuba because, God damn it, we're a separate country, etc. But we're also cooperating with you under your embargo secretly. We've sent an intelligence officer to Langley to be trained, and he's now working for the CIA. I mean, they're doing all these they're playing all these games at once. And that's the problem with being a very small country next to a very big country, wanting to have your own independence, but also realizing which side of the bread the American butter, your bread on.
You're always on kind of walking in line.
Sure. Also because we've got a British ancestry, we just don't trust them.
Well, Scottish and British.
Sure. Or we just think we know better. It's just like the British way.
I think it played a big role. When he came in, he blew up Eisenhower's staffing. Eisenhower had a very sophisticated foreign policy, intelligence policy staffing mechanism that based on his work from World War II and running NATO. And Kennedy said, it's too slow. We want dynamic action, and he killed the whole thing. And people like Maxwell Taylor said this was, who's later head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Kennedy, said this was a disaster. It was a terrible idea, and he created an adhocracy, and people didn't know what was going on. And so I think it's a big mistake. And then the Vienna conference was a fiasco. In October 1961, a reporter said, met with Kennedy and said, I'd like to do a book on your foreign policy. And Kennedy just expostulated, my God, you want to do a book about failure? So I think it played a big part, certainly in that first year.
Okay, right, so I think we're coming up to coffee time. You had a question, but...
It's a very quick, actually.
Okay.
This is another question for Asen, actually, sort of dovetails with something you ended with, which is that, if there was, sort of secretly these close communications, was there anyone in the U.S. government who said, look, Diefenbaker's saying these things, but who cares? Just let him talk. We already have these, they're already agreeing to everything. I mean, obviously, it didn't sort of percolate up to the presidential level, but is there anyone sticking up for Canada in the State Department somewhere? Is this one of the reasons why they shut down the Canada desk by any chance? Or?
Well, some people at the Canada desk are saying good things. People at the NSC critically, I think, are, because, of course, they're very close to them. So there's all these, people like Lansdale are saying the Canadians are selling the Cubans, machine parts that we don't sell them anymore. We've got to blow up Canadian ships or, impose a trading with the enemy act. And people in the NSC are going, we get all our good oil from Canada. Things don't match here. So there's sort of pro-Canadian voices saying the economic costs of imposing anti-third country trade against Canada on the Cuban issue. It's going to be a disaster. And these are the arguments that go on after Helms-Burton. Clinton's always put that exemption from every country, but especially for Canada. We give you, you're American, so we give you, all your good oil, but other things too. You're welcome.
Thank you. On behalf
Thank you for not, attacking us over Cuba.
Okay, well, thank you very much for doing that papers.